but I may have turned it off thinking I was turning it on. So, for everybody that's watching online, apparently I had the mic off when I read that. We just read the first 14 verses, and now we're going to talk about them. If you want to read those first 14 verses real quick, you can. So, these are things that are better. These are things that, we tend not always to make good judgments about what's good and what's bad. And we're going to see that from these verses here. So let's talk about these. I'm going to try to pick these out as we talk about them. And in my hand scratch, we'll put them up on the board. Not every comparison is vital. Some of the comparisons are illustrations. For instance, the first one, a good name is better than precious ointment. That's not really the point. The point is the day of death is better than the day of birth. I think most people understand that having a good reputation is of good purpose. We like to have a good reputation. We like for people to think well of us. We understand that it's better to have a substantive reputation than it is just to smell good. We recognize that there's substance in one, not in the other. So the question is, if that's true, then the next one is true that's paired with it. Would we generally think that the day of death is better than the day of birth? Is that how we would think about ourselves? Would we say, you know what? The day I die is going to be the best day of my life. And that is not how we would assess life. And that's not how we view life for other people. We celebrate birthdays. We don't celebrate death days. So the first thing that we want to look at is he says, that the day of death is better than birth. Now we need to try to find out why that is. And I think a natural person, especially if this is a new idea, if I'm reading this for the first time, and I read that, my question is going to be, well, why would he say that? And so this is what we call active reading. And what active reading means is, okay, I have this question. Now, as I continue reading, I'm trying to figure out what the answer to that question is. Why does he say that death is better than birth? And I told you in the recap, we looked at verse 3 from chapter 6, where he said, better is a stillborn child than someone who lives life and don't appreciate the good things of life. There are lots of things throughout the Scriptures that teach similar things. We think about Job and the story of Job, and Job kind of goes through this in a negative progression, right? He starts off by saying, well, it'd be better to die. Then he goes, well, it'd be better to die as a child. Then he says it'd be better to be born stillborn. Then he says it'd be better to not be born at all. Then he finally says it'd be better to not be conceived. He progressively gets more negative in his assessment. But the Bible is actually full of those kinds of statements. And so we have to ask the question, why is the day of death better than the day of one's birth? Okay. And we have to consider it within the context that we're talking about as well. We're talking about examining life, and what has he continually been finding? Well, this is vain, and this is vain, and if this is what life is, well, this is vain. He keeps, well, what's the purpose in living then? If everything we do is empty and pointless, what's the purpose in living? And so there's one aspect of this that we can be thinking about as we go along. And then again, understand part of what's happening here in chapter 7, at least the first half of chapter 7, is he's trying to readjust our evaluation about what's important in life and how we should make judgments about things. And he starts off with a really big one by saying to us something that is going to hit a square between the eyes as being a new idea, that it's better for me to die than it is for me to be born. And notice verse 14. In the day of prosperity be joyful. In the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other so that man may not find out anything they'll be after him. Now that second half of that is repeated from earlier in the book, that man can't find out anything that'll be after him. And he is talking about both the day of joy and the day of adversity. And he says, what should our attitude be toward both of those things? What's he say? God made them both. So, in the day of prosperity, be joyful. And in the day of adversity, consider God made that too. And this tells us, by the way, tells us point blank, why is there adversity for man on the earth? Where'd that come from? What's verse 14 say? The day of adversity, consider God has made the one, that's the day of prosperity, as well as the other. So God has set this order up that allows for adversity to happen. Does sin cause adversity? Sure. But why? And you go all the way back to Genesis and you got to remember, who caused the eating of the fruit to separate man from God? God. Who caused that act to set in motion the fact that men would have to work for their food? That women's pain in childbirth would be increased. That there was for lack of a better term, a pecking order created in marriage. Where the wife would have a desire for her husband, but he shall rule over you. In other words, there's now an ordinate-subordinate relationship within the marriage. That all got created by who? By God. The world began to grow for us thorns and thistles easier than it did grow for us our food. Set in order by God. There's adversity in that. You ever tried to grow a garden? There's lots of adversity in growing gardens. There's sometimes you put all sorts of work into it, everything looks beautiful and wonderful, and then all of a sudden the rain stops, everything dies, and you get nothing for your work. How frustrating is that? Or the bugs come in and eat everything. Or the birds come in and eat everything. Or if you live in the right part of the world, the deer come in and eat everything. You work and you work and you work and you do everything you can, and still this adversity approaches you, and you get nothing for your labor. How vain is that? And so what he's saying is, we need to keep in mind that when we have those adverse things happen to us, the one who allows that to be, the one who made the order that allows for adversity, is God. Does that change our opinion about how we view adversity? And so let's go through this and look at what he says. Verse 2 is built off of the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. So mourning is greater than feasting. Now, is that the way we would think of things? Do we get all excited? Oh, I get to go to a funeral today. Or do we go, oh, I get to go to a party today, and I have to go to a funeral. I got a friend that passed away. It's a sad day, but I have to go. But yet he says that it's better to be, that this is the better circumstance. Our general judgment is that it would be better to be somewhere that's happy. He says it's better to go somewhere where they're mourning death. Why? Well, that's the end of all of us, and the living takes it to heart. There's something to be gained from that adverse situation. There's something to learn. Yes, sir.
All of this is in opposition to the way that mankind thinks. And it reminds me of the scripture that says, the way that seems right to a man leads to death. And that's pretty much how people are.
Yes. Told y'all going to have fun reading my handwriting. See, I can write that early before we even get to the verse. You still don't know what the verse is going to say. The next one he says is sorrow is better than laughter. Is that the way that we would judge things? Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart may be made glad. That seems crazy, right? So why would he say that? Well, again, this all stems. Death is better than birth. Mourning is better than feasting. Sorrow is better than laughter. Let's see what he continues to say. It's better, verse 5, for a man to hear rebuke than to hear the song of fools. Rebuke is better than a song. Is that how we would appraise the situation? Do you like someone coming up to you and correcting you and telling you what you're doing wrong? Or would you rather hear a song? I know lots of people that pay lots of money to go sit and listen to people sing. I haven't ever heard of anyone who paid money to have someone come to them and chew them out. Tell them everything that they're doing wrong. Nobody pays for that. Why? We don't like that. But what he just said is that rebuke is better than the song. As long as the rebuke comes from where? From wisdom. There is some foolish rebuke out there that can't help you, but here's the message. And this is the theme that we're going to see running through all this. All of these things that we count as being adversity and as things that we try to avoid, we go out of our way to try to avoid these things if we can. What we're seeing is there's something to learn there. There's something to learn from death. There's something to learn from being at the funeral. There's something to learn from the sorrow. There's something to learn from the rebuke. I can become a better person from those things. Look at verse 6. This is an explanatory verse. It's not introducing a new idea. It's explaining. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. All right, so what's this crackling of thorns under a pot? I grew up in East Texas, so I'm going to turn this into an East Texas illustration rather than whatever part of the world this comes from. You can light a fire really, really easy with the pine straw that's on the ground. Pine straw will burn in a second. But that's its downfall. Pine straw will burn in a second. In just a moment, it's gone. It doesn't create enough heat to do any good. It doesn't burn long enough to do any good. And that's the image that's being created here. This wispy kind of thorn bush that you throw in the fire and it just burns up and then it's gone. As the crackling of thorns under a pot, that doesn't help you any. Noise and sparks doesn't help you any. What do you need from a fire? Heat. And for how long? Longer than a moment. And so he's saying that that's pointless. So is the laughter of the fools. So when we look at this other side, feasting and laughter and song, frivolity, do we enjoy those things? Certainly. Are they indicative of someone who's happy and joyful at the moment? Yes. But what happens? It goes away. How quickly does it go away, by the way? The joy disappears the moment adversity shows its face. Joy doesn't survive adversity for most people. People can go from being in a good mood to being in a bad mood very quickly. That's a danger. You know what the problem is? We focus on the wrong things. We're looking for the wrong things. We're looking for things that don't provide lasting results to us. When we're happy and joyful and singing songs, we're not thinking about changing. We're not thinking about learning. We're not thinking about mistakes. What are we thinking about? Life is great. Everything is just as it should be. And then the water heater goes out, and we start crying what? Why does this stuff always happen to me? Why does everything always go wrong? That kind of stuff, he's saying, is empty, it's vain, doesn't have any substance to it, and it doesn't last when we put our focus on material things in our material existence. But if we're focusing on the fact that the material things come to an end, that's what death represents, right? How long are we on the earth? This is a chance for our reference to James. James, is it chapter 4? Life is but a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Death is the beginning of what? Eternity. That's much more substantive. So if I learn by being in a house of mourning that death is impending and that I need to be preparing for death rather than here and now, I'm the better off. If I learn from sorrow that this earth is not my home, that I'm not designed to have a good time here on earth, I'm designed to do what? Long to be with God. Strive to be with Him. If I learn that from sorrow, that's a good thing. Rebuke. No one has ever learned anything from being right. The only time we learn is when we are confronted with the fact that we are wrong. If I'm right, I don't have anything to learn from. I don't have anything to learn. But when I realize my mistakes, those are places that I can become better. That's why I talk about testing and I say we get it all wrong. We think that a successful test is one in which a student gets 100%. That's not right. A successful test is one that shows a student where they need to work harder, where their weaknesses are. If the test isn't designed properly and it doesn't show the weaknesses, then a student can't learn from it. Again, going to the book of James, the first chapter of James. He says, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you incur various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, that you should be complete, lacking in nothing." As you go through that trial process, that testing process, where you are shown where your weaknesses are, those rebukes, you can move toward completion and maturity. Yes, sir. That's okay. I understand. But there's still a test at some point that has shown you your weakness and your mistake. Whether it be, and if we're going to use a school illustration, whether it be from the homework that I learned while I'm doing my homework, and then that way when I'm tested, I have already fixed my mistakes. That whole process is the testing period. Not the test itself that we think of being given. You understand what I'm saying? The process of we'll use the term test as it comes to purifying metal. It's that crucible that the fire burns all the impurities out of, and then what you have left is what? The pure metal. the crucible is what's going on right now when we're experiencing sorrow and rebuke and correction and learning of our mistakes. Hopefully we fix those things, and the end result, see, life is the test, in other words. But see, the goal is graduation. The goal is not 100% on the test. That's the school illustration that I would use.
Okay, but spiritual test, you don't make 100% on it. Which way are you going?
Well, let me ask this question. Is anyone going to make 100% on the spiritual test?
Well, I'm talking about at the end.
I understand. And that's we're talking about the same thing. That's what I'm trying to get us to understand, that it's not what happens in the midst of the test, it's where we end up. And that's what he's saying. The reason why death and mourning and sorrow and rebuke are good is because they can move us toward the place we need to be.
And I think the same thing with all these comparisons we're studying and we're putting up here before. You can look at that as if you had a funnel that had two ends to it.
Okay. Right. I think I understand what you're picturing with your words. I think I understand what you're saying, and I agree. Let's keep talking, and by the time we get to the end, I think we'll all be in agreement. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning. Is that the way we think? Do we go, oh, I'm so glad my vacation has come to an end. I'm so glad that job is behind me. Or do we get excited when we get the job? Do we get excited when we start the vacation? Do we get excited when our marriage begins? Which one's the happy occasion? When the marriage begins or when the marriage ends? When the child is born or when the child dies? Which one's better? See, but he says that the end of the matter is better than the beginning. Well, that's backwards. Just like all these other ones seem backwards by the way that we judge life. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? How many people talk about the good old days? See, the past is good, and we're terrified of the future. Things were so... When I was a kid, it was like this. What's everybody talking about right now? In America. I have to narrow it down. The economy and gas. Gas prices, oil prices, we're complaining. Somebody moved into the city of Orange about the same time that I did, within a year or two of when I did. Posted something on Facebook the other day. It was a photograph from the Billups gas station. Anybody remember Billups? It was a photograph from the Billups gas station that you saw in Orange on right after you got off the freeway, the main exit in Orange. And gas in 1971 was 19 cents a gallon. 1971, 19 cents a gallon. And they just said that this is what gas prices were when I moved to Orange. You could fill up your car for less than putting a gallon of gas in your tank today. Was his observation. The good old days. That's what it's talking about. Say not, why were the former days better than these? Where did he start? At the beginning of this book? I actually think it was, I don't remember if it was chapter, I think it's chapter 3 where he says it, but he goes through this whole process, and then he says what? That there's nothing new under the sun. If there's nothing new under the sun, then pray tell how the old days could be better than the present. If there's nothing new, if today is essentially just like yesterday, and they both are essentially what tomorrow is going to be, if there's nothing new under the sun, there wasn't a time period where there wasn't vanity in the world. There wasn't a time period where there wasn't suffering that mankind had to face. There's nothing new. Behold, of what can you say? This is new, the writer said. Be not quick to say the former days are better than these. It's not from wisdom that you ask this. It's not wisdom that says it used to be better than it is. Wisdom is good with inheritance and advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. Is there some protection of money? Sure. Money supplies some temporal security, doesn't it? You can secure your food, you can secure shelter, you can get places and things that you need. You can get things done. Somebody that doesn't have any money has a rough life. Somebody that has plenty of money is much more secure. So there is some protection to money. It's temporal, and he's already dealt with that. He said, don't pursue wealth in your life because that's vain if that's all you're living for. But there is some protection to it. He says wisdom offers the same kind of protection. You know what else he's already talked about earlier in the book? That wisdom by itself is vain. But he's talking about now wisdom with an inheritance. When you couple wisdom and the things that you need, now that's something you can work with. The advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. That language right there, God made crooked. Again, I go back to Genesis 3. Who put the order in place on the earth that makes all these kinds of things happen? Who separated man from the tree of life? Who made the ground grow thorns and thistles rather than food? Who gave us these laws, if you want to call them that bring about death, mourning, sorrow, rebuke, and an end to life? Who can straighten them? Can I undo that? Can I make a world that's a utopia where no one dies? Where no one ever has to feel sorrow? Where we can just feast and laugh and sing all the time? Where we never have to face rebuke? Can I create that world? Can I straighten what God has made crooked? And yet, what do we spend most of our time doing as a collective group on the earth? What does mankind spend most of his time trying to do? Create that utopia. That's what we want our government to do for us, right? If there's a problem, fix it. There's too many people dying. Stop them from dying. That disease, get rid of it. Fix this problem, fix that. We don't want to live in a world that has hard days. We want to live in a world that's at peace, where I can have joy and laughter and listen to songs and watch movies. Who can straighten what God has made crooked? We can't create the kind of world that we value and that we strive after. What we can do is learn the lessons that God built into the life that we have. Turn with me, keep your finger here. We may not have time to come back. Let's go over to 2 Corinthians for a moment. If you follow the Facebook page, you might have seen this already. I posted something about this morning. Chapter 1, I believe it is. verses 8 and 9, or 9 and 10. 8 and 9. All right, here is Paul writing to the church at Corinth, and I want you to listen carefully to his words. For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. What is he describing? A life full of mourning and sorrow, to the point that he said we weren't able to bear it. What does it mean when it says that we despaired of life itself? They wanted to die. Now you remember what we just read from the book of Ecclesiastes? The day of one's death is better than the day of his birth, which comes on the heels of the observation that if this is the way life is, that it's better to be stillborn than to be born into this life in chapter 6. Paul says that's where they were at. They were burdened beyond our strength, that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. Well, basically all of us have actually received the sentence of death, right? It is appointed unto man to... So we've all actually been... Now, sometimes that's more immediate than the way we think of that verse. Yes, I know I'm going to die one day. I hope it's a good number of days away. Why do I think that way, by the way? Why do I say I want my death to be years down the road? Because I don't view life through the day of one's death as better than the day of one's birth. So he said, we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. These turmoils that we faced in Asia, this burden that we carried in Asia that was so great that we couldn't bear it ourselves and we just wanted to die, he said that was to make us appreciate our reliance upon God. This is real similar to another thing that he wrote to the church at Corinth. Remember the thorn in the flesh that he had? And he said, I besought God 3 times, and God said what? My grace is sufficient for you. And he learned that thorn in the flesh, whatever it was given to him to do what? Keep him humble. Keep him humble in what way? Well, I think the same way that he's talking about there, to remember that he relies upon God, that he doesn't trust in himself. Listen, if we're living a life of feasting and laughter and song, guess what? If we solve all of our problems, if there's not a hard day in life, if a problem arises and I fix it, what do I start thinking? We don't need God anymore. By the way, that's why it's more difficult for a rich man to get into heaven. Because he's got the temporary protection of money. He puts more reliance upon that than he does on God. He doesn't understand that he needs God. And so what we're seeing here in this section of Ecclesiastes is that being faced with death and mourning and sorrow and rebuke and understanding that the end is better than the beginning, all of that helps us understand our reliance upon God. And isn't that what James essentially was saying? Count it joy when you incur various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces. Now, it doesn't work for everyone, because some people face mourning and sorrow and they do despair and they give up and they don't turn to God. So there is an aspect of this that we're involved in. We have to realize, we have to open our eyes and realize, wait a minute, I'm going to die. And I don't have any control over that. I don't even have any control over when it is. Raise your hand if you know what day you're going to die. You mind if I use you for a minute? Okay. When you got your diagnosis, how'd that make you feel?
Oh, I mean, kind of
Did it make you more aware of God or less aware of God? It's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting, because that's the end of every... When we realize that we're mortal, that we don't have any control over it, that it's going to happen and it's outside of our control, but God has the power to raise us from the dead. God had the power to give Hezekiah 15 more years. God has the power of life and death. If I put my reliance on Him, that changes everything. I live each day in reliance to Him. My only question is not what I think needs to be done. My question is what does God think needs to be done? That's what I need to be doing. I rely on God to direct my steps. As long as I think I'm in control, then I rely upon myself to direct my steps. Where does that end up? There's a way which seems right to man, but its way is destruction. Got to stop. We have to turn the way we look at these things on its head. Difficult things, they're not any fun. I'm not saying they're fun. But we can grow from them and get better from them and use them to make our reliance upon God greater. Use them to build our faith rather than destroy it. Got to stop. Thanks for your participation. I have no idea who that was. It didn't stop. It's got to be hit twice. I thought